Gentleman's time has expired, and now we recognize the distinguished chairman of the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee, Mr. Davidson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you to our witnesses. I appreciate this hearing and the importance of it. I mean, China is an important strategic rival. Frankly, I would like to keep them economic rivals. And as a former military guy, I didn't think we would ever visit to China in friendly terms and conditions, and I hope that we can keep it friendly competition. We're concerned about recent events and kind of what does that signal for the relationship. But as we look at how has China risen, part of it was under Deng Xiaoping, China broke from what had failed. Cultural revolution, Mao's various forms of Marxist ideology that produced a communist state that was not working. And under Deng Xiaoping, he kind of said, well, we'll have communism with Chinese principles, which is really state-controlled capitalism. And on balance, it's worked pretty well for the Chinese people, but part of that's come at the expense of the American people. You know, I'm happy for the average Chinese person, and we certainly understand why they want a better future for themselves and for their kids. But we should want the same for our families. And in recent history, we've seen this recent generation say that they're not confident that their kids are going to have a better future than they are. That's the first time in American history that's been true. And why is that? Part of it is policy decisions that have overwhelmingly benefited the Chinese Communist Party and the influence of China. So as we talk about the role of financial services in that, in 2019, China was designated as a currency manipulator. So, would one of you care to highlight briefly for the, people watching at home, the dozens or so, how does China control their exchange rate with the United States? Mr. Lorber?
I'm not a macroeconomist, so I can't really speak to that in an effective way. I apologize.
That's okay. Well, it trades in about a 2% band. The U.S. dollar is one of the currencies that are in there, and it's a peg. So they set it at an artificial rate. So when they decide that they're not getting enough, exports out of China into America, or in particular, they'll change the peg to the U.S. dollar. So that makes everything cheaper. So in 2019, when they did that, they moved it by about 16.8%. And for that, the Secretary of the Treasury rightly designated them a currency manipulator. That is able to overcome, all sorts of things. Tariffs at the time, they're fine, we'll just manipulate our currency and make everything different. The other thing that I'm interested in talking about in this space is kind of the link to the Belt and Road. Of course, it creates big trade consequences, and that creates consequences on the flow of cash, the balance of payments. But when you look at the role of the International Monetary Fund in liquidity globally, special drawing rights are one of those things. It's not really money, but it represents an asset. And the mix was recently changed. So it went from about 10% RMB to almost 13% RMB. And so the bill that I've got, H.R. 510, the Chinese Currency Accountability Act, requires the Secretary of Treasury to oppose an increase in the weight of China's RMB in the basket of currencies that make up the IMF's special drawing rights, unless China meets certain international standards. And we know China doesn't meet them. They promised to be part of the World Trade Organization, that they would be a market economy. They said that as part of being a market economy, they wouldn't do things like manipulate their currency. So, Mr. Wellams, could you please talk about those dynamics, particularly with the relation to the IMF?
Sure. Let me first say I think you've put your finger on a really important issue. And from a broad standpoint, we want to promote the supremacy of the U.S. dollar, and we should be concerned about China trying to put forward the RMB as an alternative to that, including in the IMF. And so I would want to work with you on the specifics of the bill. I think the concept is correct, and we should do what we can to prevent them from increasing the role of the RMB. One of the problems with the IMF that we often run into is our ability to unilaterally achieve things as opposed to having to work and develop broader coalitions. So I would want to think about whether the criteria are the right criteria to build that coalition of allies to get the job done.
Thank you, and my time's expired. I yield.